It's not hard for them to figure out the way you show Jesus. You know love is what they heard, and you didn't even say a word. Ain't it funny, that's the way it works. So when you know Jesus, oh, it's like flipping on a light switch when you're walking into this room. It's so undeniable. I gotta tell you that I like the way anytime, anywhere, any place, it's written all over your face, the way you love Jesus.
We love you, Mrs. Weiss.
Mrs. Weiss was an incredible person who never put herself first. She always went out of her way to do whatever she could for anyone else. She was always enthusiastic, and I rarely ever saw her sad.
Mrs. Weiss was the most unselfish person I've ever met. She had the biggest heart and was always helping out in some way. She was always there to support everyone, through good times and bad. She's always been our class's mother, and always will be.
Mrs. Weiss had the best laugh I've ever heard. A simple laugh from her could make a smile on anyone's face. I remember whenever I was down after a basketball or volleyball game, she would give me a hug and find a way to make me laugh. She's truly an angel.
It is truly impossible to define Mrs. Weiss. She was so many things to so many different people. But no matter her title, it was always synonymous with love. I will never forget her smile. It showed sincere concern for your life and what you had to say. She was the mom that would be willing to drive you home, even if your house was across town. And she made the best enchiladas. My mom's never tasted the same.
Mrs. Weiss was one of the kindest people I knew. She always tried to make everyone feel welcome, and she helped other people whenever she could. She'll be dearly missed.
Mrs. Weiss was an inspiration that will live on in all of our hearts forever, and she truly lived out what it meant to make the most of every day.
Mrs. Weiss was a kind, caring person who always took time out of her day to help others. She always had a smile on her face. She's a role model and a great teacher. She'll always be missed for the people who loved her. She taught me to be the best person I can be and treat others with the respect they deserve. She'll be missed for her loving actions and care for others.
Not many could match how much she cared for her class and how much she was an inspiration to our grade. We will all remember the time and effort she sacrificed for others.
Mrs. Weiss taught me the importance of caring for others and spending quality time with friends. I will always remember our Lumen Christi class of 2012 because of all of the fun activities and service projects she set up. I will always have a special spot in my heart for Mrs. Weiss, and the memory of her always choosing me to lead the Jesus Was Cool Dude prayer.
How do you commemorate someone who's made you laugh, made you a better person, given all for you? This is Mrs. Weiss. After 10 years with Lumen Christi, I've seen a lot of parents, but none of them could compare with Mrs. Weiss. She truly was an angel from God and was a great example of the light of Christ, our school meaning. None of these parents would have done what Mrs. Weiss did for all of us. After 10 years, it truly was a blessing.
Mrs. Weiss treated every kid she knew as her own. She was such an inspiration and a beautiful, caring person. She was the perfect example of the light of Christ. I was so lucky to know her. I will never forget all that she has done for me and what she has done for this school and her community. She has taught me how to be a good person and not to be selfish. She accomplished so much and helped so many people and has left such an impact on my life. I will miss her so much, and she will continue to shine as the light of Christ in my life.
Mrs. Weiss was like a second mom to everyone. She deeply cared about each individual and was closer to each one of us than anyone else could have ever imagined.
Mrs. Weiss was the most caring individual I have ever met. Every day she would ask me how my day was going, and this simple act of kindness just showed how much she really cared for me and everyone else. I will never forget her.
Mrs. Weiss, there really aren't words to describe the type of person that she was like. She brought us all closer. 8th grade year and beforehand, everyone will remember her as the amazing person who always put others before herself.
Mrs. Weiss to me was a loving, giving, kind, and compassionate person. She always planned parties that included everyone in our class. She wanted everyone to always be together and look at the good in all people. Mrs. Weiss was also friendly in the hallways when we walked past each other. I am grateful that I got to know her and that she made an impact in our lives. Thoughts and prayers go out to her family.
Mrs. Weiss was a woman of great significance. Her light will always shine on me. I looked up to her as a role model and a fantastic mother. There will always be a place for her in my heart. Through her volunteer work at Lumen Christi and all the events that brought us together as a grade, she has truly been the glue that held our class together. Thank you very much, Mrs. Weiss. You are a woman who will be dearly missed.
Mrs. Weiss was such a giving and caring person who made everyone feel special in his or her own way. She gave from her heart and did special things for everyone in fun and exciting ways. I will always remember how she lived to make people happy.
Mrs. Weiss was one of the most generous, most caring people I have ever known that always puts a smile on everyone's face and has brightened up everyone's day.
Mrs. Weiss was always helping other people out and making life a little bit easier for others. She showed us to use our gifts and time to help others as well with her dedication to the school. She was truly a blessing for all of us.
Mrs. Weiss is the reason why our class is so close. Everything she did was for others, and she taught us how to be all the saints of her. Without her, we wouldn't be the class we are today. She was a blessing to everyone.
Mrs. Weiss was one of the most charitable and generous people I've ever known. She put so much of her time behind our 8th grade class, and that is the reason why I will remember our 8th grade class forever.
I always remember that Mrs. Weiss was a huge part of our 8th grade class. She always did a lot to help us. I'm really, really going to miss her for all that she's meant to me and the rest of my 8th grade.
She taught our class to come together and be one through her reunions and 8th grade socials. She truly did put others first, and she always made sure that others were taken care of before she was.
Mrs. Weiss always put everyone before herself no matter what. She's truly a role model for everyone, especially me. I will always remember her, and she will always be in my heart.
It's easy to say that Mrs. Weiss was a terrific mom who really brought the 8th grade class together, but she truly was the reason for it. She was always behind the scenes of our field trips and class get-togethers and making them the best that they could be, even though we didn't notice it sometimes. She was truly a terrific woman. She'll always be remembered, and she will always be missed.
The first memory I had of Mrs. Weiss was in 2nd grade, and my mom, she forgot to put me on the shuttle bus in the morning. And so she was looking for rides to get me to the Thiensville campus, and Mrs. Weiss pulls up and says, "Oh, I'll just take them." And my mom and I didn't know Mrs. Weiss at the time, and she rolled down the window, and Maddie was there. She's like, "Maddie and Marco in the same grade," and so I'll just take them. So she put me in the car with a random stranger, and we still joke about that. So I just want to thank Mrs. Weiss for doing everything she could. She would pay money just to see a kid smile, and it was great.
Mrs. Weiss was the nicest, most kindest, and caring lady I have ever known, and I will always remember the class of Lumen Christi 2012.
Mrs. Weiss was always involved at school and was very good at uniting our 8th grade class. She always hosted events and planned things so that we get to know each other better, and those friendships have lasted even into our high school years.
Mrs. Weiss watched over our grade throughout the years, strengthening our bond our class has to this day. I'm so grateful to have her in my life to this day.
Mrs. Weiss was always able to keep us together as a class. She really kind of put things together. We would have never been as close as we were without Mrs. Weiss, and I want to thank her for that.
Mrs. Weiss was an extraordinary person. I've never met anyone who has been able to touch the lives of so many people. Because of her, I am a better person. She showed each and every person what it meant to be a true and genuine human being.
Mrs. Weiss put her time and effort into making our year special out of the goodness of her own heart. Her positivity and giving spirit helped our class become and stay as close as we are today.
Despite Mrs. Weiss being kind-hearted, she's additionally optimistic. She took care of our community, myself included. I didn't have time to appreciate and thank her for her service. Instead, I'm doing that now. I will not be able to compensate for her help. However, I want to take the time to acknowledge her efforts. As part of the community, I want to give back to her. Mrs. Weiss spent countless hours volunteering at Lumen Christi. Whether she would be helping a grade sign a card or making sure we all had a part in the shamrock artwork for our grade, she seemed to enjoy every moment. To have a person, such as Mrs. Weiss, playing a role in the development of my grade was a wonderful experience.
Mrs. Weiss brought our 8th grade class together by organizing events. She inspired everyone because she was so willing to help others. and that is why I will never forget her.
Mrs. Weiss was like a mother to me. She made everyone around here feel extremely comfortable and made them feel at home, even if they just met.
Mrs. Weiss is my second mom, and I loved her so much. She was always a true inspiration to me, and I'm going to miss her on the basketball court, on and off. I'm also going to miss her through all of her inspiration that she gave to me by putting everyone's needs above her own. I love you so much, Mrs. Weiss, and you'll always have a place for me in my heart.
Mrs. Weiss was truly a blessing for anyone who encountered her. She was always there to have a helping hand.
Anybody out here could say something nice about Mrs. Weiss. Very few could say something bad about her. And the few that could would just be liars. She was one great person. I'm glad to have known her.
Without Mrs. Weiss's help, our 8th grade year and our time at Lou Christie wouldn't have been the same fun time as it was. She will always be remembered for her kindness, and her care for everyone.
She was not just a normal mom, she was and is still a role model for me. Mrs. Weiss willingly gave her time for all the planned 8th grade socials, trips, volunteer work, and class activities. I will remember her as an LC mom, but also as a lady who showed us what being a class is all about.
There are no words as to how much Mrs. Weiss meant to me. I'll never forget the time at our 8th grade class trip in Washington, D.C. when we visited the Holocaust Museum, and I lost it. She was there for me forever for the whole trip and just hugged me for so long after, and she's helped me through everything, and she's helped so many other people, and she was such an angel, and she's going to be the best guardian angel we've ever had.
Mrs. Weiss was an extremely kind person and a great role model. No one could be more nice or caring than she was. I will forever remember the LC class of 2012 through all the time and effort she put in to organize all the fun events that we shared together as a class. She was the most unselfish person that I have ever met, and I will remember her forever.
We love you, Mrs. Weiss. You'll always be in our hearts.
It said charge the battery pack as soon as I hit the...